Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
I'm 23 and work at a hardware store. I've been there for about 8 months now, ever since I graduated from community college with my associate's degree in business. The job pays decent for what it is, and I was saving up money to transfer to a 4-year university. My main duties include helping customers find what they need and mixing paint at our paint counter. I'm African American with a lighter skin tone, which becomes important later in this story. The store I work at is pretty busy, especially on weekends when everyone's doing their home improvement projects. We carry 3 major paint brands and do a lot of custom color mixing. Most customers are pretty reasonable, but every now and then you get someone who makes your day absolutely miserable. That day started normal enough. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was working my usual shift at the paint counter. I'd already helped several customers that morning without any issues. Then she walked up. This woman approached my counter holding a paint chip sample. She looked to be in her 40s, had that haircut, and was wearing expensive-looking clothes. Right away, something about her attitude put me on edge. I greeted her politely and asked how I could help. I noticed she was holding a paint chip that looked like a mid-tone color somewhere between honey gold and marigold. For those who don't know much about paint, those two colors are basically fraternal twins, very similar but with slight differences. She told me she needed paint in that color. I asked her what brand she preferred since we carried 3 different brands. She snapped back that she didn't know and told me to figure it out myself because it was my job. That's when I knew I was dealing with one of those customers. I kept my professional smile on and walked over to our paint computer to type in the color specifications. I told her I could work with our generic brand and asked if she wanted a gallon or a quart because I needed to know the size for the dispenser. She told me to get whichever size could cover a deck patio. That's when it hit me. She wasn't looking for regular paint at all. I explained to her that it sounded like she needed an exterior stain for her deck, not paint, and that we don't do custom colors for stains because our computer system can't handle that process. She looked at me like I just told her the worst news of her life. I could feel the temperature rising and I was already starting to sweat from the stress of this interaction. She demanded that I figure something out because she needed the paint for that evening. I sighed and decided to ask my manager if we could make an exception. My manager was hesitant at first since it wasn't standard procedure, but they agreed as long as I did it correctly and took responsibility for the results. I got the paint can ready, added the custom color mixture, and put it in the paint mixer to stir everything up. While it was mixing, she decided to add more pressure by telling me to make sure it was perfect because she didn't want to come back. I rolled my eyes when she wasn't looking and waited for the paint to finish mixing. When it was done, I pulled the can out and opened it to show her the color. It looked exactly like her paint chip sample. I told her the paint should match her sample perfectly, but she immediately complained that it wasn't the right color and wasn't what she had asked for. She then turned to my manager, who was working at the counter nearby, and asked if I could even mix paint or if I was just colorblind. Then she made a racist comment asking if I was even from Africa. I felt my blood pressure spike at that comment. I turned around and took a deep breath, trying to keep my composure and not lose my job over this ignorant woman. I told her that if she had been more specific about what she needed from the beginning, we wouldn't be having this problem. That's when it happened. Out of nowhere, I heard a sharp smack and felt the sting across my cheek. This woman had actually slapped me across the face in front of the entire store. Did she just hit me? I thought to myself, shocked that someone would actually do that to a store employee. By now, everyone in the store was watching our interaction. Other customers had stopped what they were doing to stare at us. My manager immediately stepped in and told her that she needed to leave the store right now. She refused to leave and said she wouldn't go until I got her paint right. She pointed directly at me and told my manager to fire me if I couldn't learn basic colors. Despite what had just happened, I was still trying to be professional. I told them it was fine and that I could make another batch if needed. I was still rubbing my cheek where she'd slapped me, but I didn't want to make the situation worse. This is where things got really ridiculous. For the next 5 minutes, I kept making different batches of the same color, and she kept saying it wasn't right. If you know anything about paint mixing, yellow-based colors like this are actually the easiest to mix because they don't require many different pigments. The color I was making matched her paint chip perfectly every single time. I was working on the sixth can when one of my co-workers came over and tapped me on the shoulder. They told me to go take my break and said they would handle the situation. I thanked them and gladly handed over the situation before going to the break room. I sat there for about 15 minutes trying to process what had just happened. I've been slapped by a customer over paint that was mixed correctly. When I came back from my break, my co-worker filled me in on what happened while I was gone. They told me she kept complaining about every single batch they made too. Eventually, she got so loud and aggressive that other customers started complaining. The manager called the police and she left without buying anything. About 20 minutes later, 2 police officers showed up at the store. They asked to speak with me about the incident. They explained that they understood there was an assault and that the store's security cameras had caught the whole thing. They asked if I wanted to press charges against the woman. I thought about it for exactly 2 seconds and told them yes, absolutely. The officers took my statement and got copies of the security footage from my manager. They explained that the woman could be charged with assault and that I might need to testify if the case went to court. A few weeks later, I found out through my manager that she had been charged and had to pay a fine. She was also banned from our store permanently. Apparently, she tried to come back a week after the incident, but security turned her away at the door. My job involves visiting different medical clinics to review their billing records and make sure they're not overcharging insurance companies for procedures that were never performed or weren't medically necessary. The company hired me straight out of college when I graduated with my accounting degree. I was drowning in student loans and desperately needed a steady paycheck. When I thought the job would be boring, just sitting in offices all day looking at paperwork. But I quickly learned that healthcare fraud is way more common than people realize. I've caught clinics billing for expensive procedures on patients who never even showed up for appointments. Most of the time when I visit a clinic, they set me up in an empty office or unused cubicle where I can work quietly without getting in anyone's way. The staff usually just wants me to finish my audit and leave as quickly as possible. I don't blame them. Nobody likes having their work scrutinized. Yesterday started like any other audit day. I arrived at the clinic around 9 in the morning wearing my usual business attire, navy blazer, white dress shirt, tie, and black slacks. My company identification badge hung from a lanyard around my neck, clearly displaying my name and the logo of the insurance auditing firm I work for. The clinic manager greeted me at the front door and apologized about a space issue. They were doing renovations in their back offices and the only place they could put me was at the front desk with the receptionist. I told them it wasn't a problem since I'd worked in worse conditions before. The receptionist seemed friendly and showed me where I could set up my laptop and spread out the files I needed to review. The front desk was large enough that we weren't cramped, and she promised to keep things quiet while I worked. For the first hour, everything went smoothly. I was deep into reviewing some questionable billing codes when the receptionist got called to the back to help with a patient situation. She apologized and said she'd return in a few minutes. I kept working on my audit, completely focused on the documents in front of me. That's when I heard someone clear their throat loudly to my right. I looked up and saw a woman standing at the counter. She was probably in her 50s with that short, layered haircut. Her arms were crossed, and she had this entitled expression on her face that I recognized immediately. The woman told me that she'd been standing there for several minutes without being acknowledged. She said I should be ashamed of myself and asked if this was how the clinic was run. I politely explained that the receptionist had stepped out for a moment and would be back soon. I told her I couldn't help her since I didn't work there. She looked me up and down. Her eyes lingered on my business attire with obvious suspicion. She asked me how stupid I thought she was, pointing out that I was sitting at the front desk of a clinic dressed professionally. She said she didn't believe I didn't work there, and threatened to file a complaint against me with my boss. I told her again that I didn't work at the clinic and explained that I worked for Morrison Insurance Auditing Services. I held up my identification badge so she could see it clearly, then said I needed to get back to my work. I turned my attention back to the billing records, hoping she'd take the hint and wait quietly for the actual receptionist to return. Instead, her voice got louder and more aggressive. She demanded to know if I knew who she was and claimed her husband worked with the owner of the clinic. She said he'd be hearing about my poor customer service skills. I told her that was nice and repeated that I didn't work there. I said she needed to wait for the receptionist. I kept my eyes on the documents, refusing to engage further. But she wasn't done. She suddenly changed her tone, putting on this fake, sweet voice. She said she was sure I was busy and wouldn't take much of my time. All she needed was information about her daughter-in-law's next obstetrics appointment. She gave me the woman's name and said it shouldn't take long to find her on the calendar. She just needed to know the appointment time so she could be there to meet her. Now I looked directly at her. This woman was asking me to violate federal privacy laws, and she seemed to think it was no big deal. I asked if she was deaf and reminded her that I'd already told her I didn't work there. I explained that even if I did work there, she was asking me to violate patient privacy laws. I told her how serious that was and said she needed to ask her daughter-in-law directly if she wanted her there, though I doubted she would. She yelled that I didn't know what I was talking about and called her daughter-in-law an unpleasant name. She said the woman should have told her when she was scheduling her first ultrasound. She claimed it was her grandchild and she needed to be there to see him. She demanded I tell her when the appointment was or she'd have me fired. I told her she needed help and should leave before I had someone call security. She asked if I was threatening her. Her voice had reached a volume that I was sure could be heard throughout the entire clinic. Right on cue, the doctor and receptionist came rushing out to the front desk to see what all the commotion was about. The doctor asked what was going on. I explained that the woman didn't understand I didn't work for them and was trying to find out about her daughter-in-law's appointment. She immediately went into victim mode, telling the doctor that I had been useless and wouldn't give her the information she'd asked for. She demanded that I be fired. The receptionist looked at her. She told the woman that I didn't work there and said she'd take care of the situation. She picked up the phone and called the clinic's security office. She told them they needed a guard to come escort someone out who was disturbing one of their vendors. When the woman realized that security was actually being called, she completely lost what little composure she had left. She said she wasn't leaving and claimed she had a right to know how her grandson was doing. For the next several minutes, she launched into a profanity-filled tirade about her rights as a grandmother and how we were all conspiring against her. The other patients in the waiting area were staring. When the security guard arrived, a large, no-nonsense guy who looked like he dealt with difficult people on a regular basis, he told her she needed to leave immediately or he would call the police for trespassing. She refused to budge, so he took her by the arm and began escorting her toward the exit. She screamed and struggled the entire way, calling us every name in the book. Even after they got her outside, we could still hear her yelling in the parking lot. The receptionist shook her head and said she was calling the police since the woman was still making a scene outside. Through the front windows, we watched two police officers arrive and have a long conversation with her. Eventually, they put her in the back of their patrol car and drove away. After things calmed down, the receptionist said she needed to call the daughter-in-law to let her know what had happened with her mother-in-law. She dialed the number and had a brief conversation. When she hung up, she was actually laughing. She told me that explained everything. The daughter-in-law and her husband had been no contact with his mother for over 2 years. The woman had been trying to force her way back into their lives ever since she found out about the pregnancy. The daughter-in-law had no idea her mother-in-law even knew where she was getting her prenatal care. It turned out she had been calling different clinics around town, pretending to be her daughter-in-law and trying to get appointment information. The clinic staff made a note in the patient's file to be extra careful about protecting her privacy going forward. I finished my audit that afternoon without any further drama. The receptionist later told me that the daughter-in-law was so grateful for how we handled the situation that she wrote a glowing review of the clinic online. She specifically mentioned how well they protected patient privacy. Meanwhile, her mother-in-law ended up with a trespassing charge and a restraining order. I bought my house 3 years ago after my divorce. It was a fixer-upper in a quiet neighborhood, and I was looking forward to having my own space where I could work on my garden and enjoy some peace. The house sat on a corner lot with a funeral home down the street and an empty lot between us that had an old run-down house on it. I figured the empty lot would stay that way for a while, which was fine by me. I work as an accountant, so I'm pretty detail-oriented when it comes to contracts and legal documents. My ex-husband used to make fun of me for reading every single line of our mortgage papers, but that habit saved me from a lot of headaches over the years. I've learned the hard way that you never sign anything without understanding exactly what you're agreeing to. The trouble started on a Tuesday night in late summer. I had just finished watering my rose bushes when I heard a knock at my door. It was already past 9 in the evening, which struck me odd timing for a business visit. When I opened the door, I saw a middle-aged couple standing on my porch. The woman was dressed in a business suit despite the late hour, and the man was holding a thick folder. The woman introduced herself and her husband, owners of the funeral home down the street. She explained that they had just purchased the property between our houses and planned to demolish the old house to build a parking lot for their clients. The man chimed in, saying they wanted to build a nice vinyl fence between our properties and would pay for everything. All they needed was for me to sign an agreement saying it was okay for them to build the fence. The man handed me the folder, and I could see it contained several pages of legal documents. I told them I would be happy to read through it and get back to them tomorrow since it was already late, but they insisted they needed me to sign it that night and couldn't leave the documents with me. I explained that I don't sign legal documents without reading them thoroughly first, and suggested they could mail me a copy instead. The woman's expression changed immediately and her friendly demeanor disappeared. She told me I was making things way more complicated than necessary and that it was just a simple fence agreement. The man stepped closer and said they needed it signed tonight because their contractors were scheduled to start work next week. I repeated that I needed time to review any legal document before signing it, but they wouldn't accept that answer. The woman got louder and told me to stop being difficult. The man became more aggressive, saying I had to sign it, and that they had already made commitments based on getting this agreement. When I said I needed time to review it, the woman snapped that they weren't leaving until I signed it. I realized these people weren't going to take no for an answer. The man then made it clear that since they owned the property next to me, they could make my life very difficult if I didn't cooperate. The woman cursed and demanded I just sign the papers so everyone could move on. I'd had enough of their pushy attitude and threats. I told them to get off my property and slammed the door in their faces. Through the window, I could see them standing on my porch for another few minutes, arguing with each other before finally leaving. The next morning, I decided to do some research. If they were planning to build a fence, there had to be city ordinances governing what type of fence was allowed. I spent my lunch break at City Hall looking through the zoning regulations. What I found was interesting. My property was zoned residential, but the funeral home property was zoned commercial. When you have two different zoning types next to each other, the city code required a very specific type of fence. It had to be an 8-foot tall solid masonry fence. Vinyl fencing wasn't allowed in this situation. A few weeks later, I came home from work to find construction crews building a fence, but it wasn't masonry. It was some kind of foam core concrete that looked like masonry from a distance. To most people, it would look like it met the city requirements, but I knew better. Then I got a letter from their lawyer. It was about the old wooden fence that had been on the property line for years. The letter threatened legal action if I touched the fence in any way, repaired it, or tried to remove it. This was clearly an intimidation tactic, but it just made me more determined to fight back. I went back to City Hall and found another interesting ordinance. The city prohibited having a fence within a fence situation. You could only have one fence per property line. Since they had built their new concrete fence but left the old wooden fence standing, they were in violation. I filed a complaint with the City Planning Commission. Within a week, I got a call saying They had ordered the funeral home owners to remove the wooden fence. When they showed up to do the work, they asked if their workers could access the fence from my side of the property line. I refused to let them use my property for access. The man complained that this would make the job much more difficult and expensive, but I told him that wasn't my problem and that he should have thought about that before trying to intimidate me. After they finished removing the wooden fence, I went back to the Planning Commission with my research about the foam core concrete fence. I showed them that the city ordinance specifically required solid masonry and explicitly forbade foam core materials in this zoning situation. The commission agreed with me. They ordered the funeral home owners to tear down their brand new fence and rebuild it with proper materials. I have to admit, watching them jackhammer their expensive new fence into pieces was pretty satisfying. While they figured out what to do next, they put up a temporary chain link fence. It was the kind that comes in panels and is supposed to be portable. The problem was that it kept falling over in the wind, and the panels would blow into my yard. After the third time I had to drag their fence panels back to the property line, I called them. I told them their temporary fence kept blowing down and they needed to secure it properly. The man dismissively told me to just put it back up when it fell down since it wasn't that hard. When I said it wasn't my responsibility to maintain their fence, the woman rudely told me to figure it out myself because they had bigger problems to deal with. That gave me an idea. I'm pretty handy with tools, and I have a welding setup in my garage. The next time their fence blew down, I dragged all the panels back to the property line and welded them together. They were no longer portable, but they definitely weren't going to blow down anymore. When the rental company came to pick up their fence, they couldn't separate the panels. The funeral home owners had to buy the entire fence setup. Summer was coming, and they were taking forever to get the permanent fence installed. I was getting tired of looking at their ugly temporary fence and construction mess. That's when I decided to have a little fun. I ordered a neon green Speedo online. Think Borat style, impossibly bright and tiny. In the evenings, I would put on my new swimwear and sit by my fire pit in the backyard. The funeral home has evening services sometimes, and their parking lot gives guests a clear view of my yard. I like to think my fashion choices helped motivate them to get that opaque fence installed more quickly. When they finally built the correct masonry fence, their workers trampled through my rose garden and destroyed about 30 feet of prize-winning rose bushes. They also broke several of my sprinkler heads. I documented everything with photos and filed another complaint with the Planning Commission. They ordered the funeral home owners to pay me damages for the destroyed roses and repair my irrigation system. But they weren't done being difficult. When they stained their side of the new fence, they left my side covered in stain splatters and drips. It looked terrible. I went back to the city ordinances one more time and found a regulation about property maintenance. If you stain or paint a fence, you're responsible for any overspray or damage to the neighboring property. The city agreed and ordered them to properly stain my side of the fence well. 5.5 years after that first knock on my door, I finally had my beautiful tall masonry fence. It completely blocks the view of the funeral home, keeps my yard private and quiet, and probably added $10,000 to my property value. Every time I see the funeral home owners, they avoid making eye contact. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.